Welcome to Page and Screen with John Paul Sarni, where each week we focus on a new or classic book that has captured the attention of the world of arts and entertainment. And today's guest is an adroit journalist who captures the glamour of the 20th century Manhattan like no one else, a contributor to the New York Times and author of The Plaza. Her new book is already a New York Times bestseller, When Women Ran Fifth Avenue, Glamour and Power at the Dawn of American Fashion. Julie Satow, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. This is amazing.
Of course. It's wonderful to meet you.
Yeah.
Now, you'll have to this book, I'm obsessed with this book. I think it's amazing. I think there's so much great, juicy gossip in here, and it basically chronicles an American century, and we get to learn about all that's happening in the world through, one of the busiest streets in New York City, because everything was affected by the two world wars and, COVID and all the rest of it. So there's so much that has gone on, and you have done so much research. What was the genesis, though? What made you focus on, ultimately, there's three women in three different decades that we're talking about in the book?
Yeah. So my agent was like, you should do something on store wars is what she wanted. Like Battle of the Department Stores. And I was like, I really want to do something on people. Like my first book, as you said, was about the Plaza, and it was a social history of New York told through the lens of the hotel. But I really wanted a through line of characters. So it was the pandemic. There was not much going on. So I was like, okay, let me just start researching and see what I find. And I stumbled on these three characters who were each so different, and I felt so compelling and fascinating. And they each represented a different part of the 20th century. And so taken together, they tell this really lovely story about the world of fashion, the world of department stores, New York, all of that, and women and work. So I was like, I have my book. That was
right, and the three women are, and I'm gonna pronounce it, I guess, the French way, but it's Hortense Odlum in the 1930s with Bonwit Teller, and then Dorothy Shaver around sort of World War II era, the 1940s and 50s at Lord and Taylor, and then a little further down the line we have Geraldine Stutz in the 50s and 60s at. I want to say Henri Bendel, but it's Henry Bendel.
Okay, no, sorry to disappoint you. It's also Hortense Odlum because she grew up in Utah, so she is not.
Well, I guess that's a controversial thing because when I went to I spend half of my time in Europe, and when I went to Italy properly for the first time, I realized that I'm pronouncing my own surname incorrectly.
There you go.
So I wonder if it's that. That's always a question. Does it matter where you're born? Because I also am from the Boston area, so I would have a very particular accent when I pronounce my own name, and
totally.
That's depending on what crowd you're in. But anyway, so it's these three women, and you focus on them, but also women like Maggie Walker and some other women that you have as asides through the book. But you basically go in chronological order, through the century, and we look at everything that has happened and transpired with them. So how did you come across these women? Where did your research guide you?
Yeah. So actually, there was a column in the Times by Vanessa Friedman, who's a fashion columnist, and she was writing about kind of bemoaning the end of the department store. And this was in, quite a number of years ago. And she mentioned that there were these two women who did these amazing things. And I was like, oh, interesting. So I started investigating them. And that was Dorothy Shaver and Geraldine Stutz. And then, and I was like, oh, that could be really interesting. But then I found Hortense, and I felt like, now I really had something. None of them have had biographies written about them. So there's, Dorothy is probably the most famous, and she's had some dissertations, PhD dissertations and stuff. But really, the materials was not. There was not a plethora of it. So it took a lot of digging. Yeah, for sure.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so, and these women who are. Who I don't think any of them had really had any kind of proper C-suite sort of jobs, and so they rose up into these ranks.
Yeah.
But what's so interesting at the beginning of the book, you're talking about the days in Bonwit Teller, and they were very Hortense was very frank about it in the advertising to the market to try to get people to come through the doors. And I think they said it was they were talking about a woman's sixth sense.
Oh, yeah.
And that kind of idea that she was very out there saying that we don't, we have a very different approach.
Yeah.
We're not going to run it like a man would run this store.
Well, right. So this was the Depression. It was the 1930s. She came in through various, events. She came in as the president of the store. She had never had a paying job before, so she'd only been a housewife and a mom. And so she really approached it like a shopper, like a woman shopping. And it was the Depression. It was really, obviously, businesses were really suffering. So she told all these kind of like grizzled manufacturers from the rag trade, the garment district. She was like, hey guys, like all these cheap dresses you're making with the doodads and the buttons and the ribbons, like they're just cheap and like women can see right through it. Take all that stuff away and just make a simple, well-designed, well-tailored dress out of good, solid fabrics. And they were like, come on, what are you talking about? That's going to make, this is how we make our money. We know what we're doing. And she's like, trust me. And they did. And it was like a huge, boon for the business. And she did like a bunch of really interesting, innovative publicity, marketing, all that kind of stuff to turn the business around. So.
Right, and she also had sort of an open door policy. Was she the one that she let customers, if they were unhappy, come right up to her office?
Right. So her strategy was like, if the employees know that if any shopper is unhappy, that I'm going to hear about it directly from them. First of all, it will make the saleswomen, et cetera, do a better job because they'll be worried about that. But also, it gives the shoppers, a feeling of like empowerment. Wow, I can go meet with the head of the store and tell them, about some terrible experience I had. That's great, So it created loyalty. I mean, it was just a very innovative idea. Before, you can imagine the male, it was Paul Bonwit, who was the president before, who was the founder of the store. I mean, he did not let, just any person come upstairs and talk to him in his, big C-suite in the department store. Yeah. So much more female approach.
Right. And it was part of her story that, as we talk about here on the show, Page and Screen, the sort of the connections, to the world of Hollywood. So I was reading, you're recounting her story when she goes into this salon and she overhears something, which led to, I think, one of the funniest plays of the 20th century that has twice been made into a movie. So tell us the story of what she overhears in this very fancy New York City salon.
Yes. So she is, as I said, this is before she became involved. She was sort of, she went to Saks Fifth Avenue, had a very fancy hair salon where all the, ladies who lunch got their hair done. And so she had her regular hair appointment, and it was towards the end of the day, so there was really no other clients in the salon. And she was having her hair done and she was having her nails manicured. And, she was just sort of bantering with her regular hairdresser. And she's quite a shy, kind of more reserved person. So she wouldn't typically be dishing about her personal life if there were lots of people around. But because it was quiet, she figured, why not? So she was just telling him, oh, my husband, he's so tired. He was a big Wall Street tycoon, I should say. One of the few people who made a ton of money during the Depression. So he was very rich. And she was saying how tired he was. And he decided he's just going to take a cruise by himself to Miami just to rest and relax and get a break from work. And she was telling this, and the manicurist happened to be listening to the conversation. And when she went downstairs to her chauffeured car to drive away, the manicurist quickly called the boat company. I don't know. These were the cruise lines. Exactly. These were back in the day of the big cruise lines. And she booked a ticket on the same cruise with the idea that, she would get her husband. And she ended up being quite a famous person in her own life. And it led to a number of things we could get into if you want, or leave it for the readers to find out about.
But it was amazing because it was that very specific thing because I remember from the play, The Women, by
exactly.
Claire Booth-Luce, which is just absolutely hilarious.
Yes, so supposedly Claire also went to the same salon, and so she knew the hairdresser who would talk about all the crazy stories that went on. So that was the genesis for the idea of the play, supposedly, according to the hairdresser who wrote his own memoir about all of this.
Right, of course. A lot of people wrote books about and Hortense wrote a book as well.
Yes, she also wrote a memoir, which was largely untrue, which was very hard to decipher as a researcher. It was filled with a lot of like wishful thinking, So like her husband, who didn't end up staying her husband for long after the manicurist got involved, was called her husband throughout the memoir, even though it was like years and years after their divorce. So there was a lot of sort of make believe, but the manicurist ended up being Jackie Cochran, who I believe wrote a book herself called The Sun in Midnight or something. I can't remember the name right now. And that has been like around Hollywood for a long time about making a movie, because she was a very famous aviatrix, and she was best friends with Amelia Earhart. And her and Hortense's husband became big fixtures in Palm Springs and with the Hollywood
and
crew
they entertained quite a lot. So they entertained like Amelia Earhart and like Eisenhower, I think. So there were a lot of famous people coming through.
Howard Hughes was like a good friend.
Right.
So yes.
Very, very specific world. Very
right,
specific
exactly,
group there.
milieu.
So talk to us a little bit about there was this moment, there was this sort of decade that, in the 1920s, these American shoppers, sort of all eyes were starting to look towards Paris, where everything was haute couture, and it was really opulent and really delicious. And then we go to the end of that decade, and obviously in 1929 there's a crash, and sort of the tide turned a little bit. And so instead of people being able to really having the resources to go on cruises and things to Paris and to acquire things and bring them back, there was this movement, and I think that maybe Lord & Taylor was one of the companies that really wanted to spotlight American designers and that sort of uplift that, we can make wonderful things at home too.
Yes. So that's correct. So obviously Paris is the center of fashion in the world. I mean, it still is in large part. But back in the early 20th century, that was even more so the case. I mean, to say American fashion, people would have laughed at you. I mean, it was a complete, misnomer. It didn't exist. There was only the garment trade, and they basically just made cheap knockoffs of Parisian original dresses. So that was it. And in the 1920s, obviously the economy was booming. It was the Jazz Age, F. Scott Fitzgerald. And yes, tons of Americans would go to Paris, and they would go to Chanel, and they would go to all the boutiques and buy clothes. And then in the Depression, that was obviously not the case anymore. Right. So Dorothy Shaver, who was who was not quite president yet, but she was very senior at Lord & Taylor, saw an opening to start marketing American designers. And she knew about them because she was in the world of department stores. And there were a handful. Most designers at that time just worked anonymously for the garment manufacturers. But there was Hattie Carnegie was one who was kind of famous, but there was a group of younger designers. And so she started naming them in her advertisements and saying a Claire McCardle dress or whatever, actually putting their name. And it created demand for American designers and helped establish their careers and really helped create the American fashion industry that we know today. So yeah.
Well, I mean, it's amazing. I think that that kind of marketing was very unique, and I think another part of the marketing that was so interesting was this idea that we don't live in this age anymore, but there are still great big department stores, places like Saks or Harrods and things like that, where especially at Christmas time we see gorgeous storefront windows. So you talk a little bit in the book about the advent of the storefront windows, and then there was a very famous author who played a very big part in bringing this the evolution of that and bringing it to people and with some clever tricks in the windows.
Yes, that's true. So L. Frank Baum, who I believe is what you're referring to, was in the theater, and it was sort of the start of department stores, and he noticed that these stores have these giant windows, and they could use some of the theatrical lighting that we use or some of the tricks of the theater to really promote it. So he started to get really into window display, and he actually even created a magazine about window display. Later on, L. Frank Baum wrote The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which became a huge movie, obviously, and he became too famous for window design, but he was really the beginning architect of the window dressing. So.
And also, there are a lot of other artists sort of through the years, like Joel Schumacher worked on, as a window dresser before he started really his Hollywood career.
Yes.
So it was,
right.
and you'd also talk about, they found ways to have like the illusion of snow and like misting perfume out onto the sidewalk.
It's almost like an early version of the movies. If you think about it, they would make stories in the windows, and they had all these artists. I mean, Salvador Dali, made tons of windows. I have some fun stories about him in the book. But he did, these kind of, surrealist designs. As you mentioned, Joel Schumacher later on in the 60s, actually, he credits one of my characters with saving his life. He had worked for Bendel's doing window dressing early on when he was young, when he was in school, and then he left. He quit to open like one of those 60s mod boutiques, Paraphernalia, which was like a big boutique in New York. And he got really into drugs, and he became a really intense addict. And Geraldine Stutz at Bendel's knew what was going on and brought him back to Bendel's and had him start doing window design again and really helped get him sober. And he said that, that relationship was pivotal for him. And then he went on, obviously, to do Batman and all the other movies.
Yeah,
so,
very, and always just a very visual filmmaker.
Very visual,
very colorful.
yes.
Now, when we talk about one of the back to Hortense for a minute,
Okay.
I can't say Hortense, which I want to, but I will try not to.
Go for it.
So, as we race through the book and we come to sort of the end of some of their stories, both Hortense personally in her own life and the store and Bonwit Teller sort of met rather tragic ends. But the interesting thing about Bonwit Teller, the store, the building itself, is that there was a real estate villain that we still know and is still in the news today. So tell us about that.
Can we talk about that?
Yeah, tell us about that building and the history of that building and sort of what happened, because it seemed like there could have been like a really nice end to that, because we see all this gorgeous architecture, especially Art Deco architecture on the streets of New York City, but some of it is now lost. And so tell us about that building and what came of it.
Yes. So after Hortense left Bonwit Teller, it went through a number of different owners and presidents and started to lose luster, like a lot of the department stores. And in 1979, a brash young developer wanted to build a big tower there. So that was Donald Trump. He was young. He was still sort of starting out in his career, and he wanted to build Trump Tower, which now stands on the footprint of Bonwit Teller. The building itself was an architectural gem. It had some very important bas reliefs on its facade. It had this grill work, things that were done, when it was erected that were very, priceless. And so when Donald Trump bought the building, he promised the Metropolitan Museum of Art that he would donate these things to the museum because they wanted them for their permanent collection. But one day, instead, people noticed that there were these construction workers who just climbed the facade of the Bonwit Teller building, and they took out these huge jackhammers and they just destroyed the bas reliefs. And then the grill work somehow just disappeared. No one ever knew what happened. It was a huge controversy in New York. The Metropolitan Museum was obviously very confused and upset. There were New York Times editorials. Donald Trump pulled out his John Barron, which is the fake spokesman that he used to employ, saying that, Donald Trump was away and out of town, or then various stories came of that. But essentially, yes, the architectural details were destroyed. Trump built his tower, and there is no more Bonwit Teller anymore. So,
and I should also say that as it is very sad. I should also say though that in the book you have wonderful photographs of a lot of what you talk about, a lot of the stores and the women that we're talking about. But I think that it's also a wonderful opportunity to. I found myself going online to look things up as well,
cool.
because it's these are the kinds of buildings and the kinds of places that really only exist now in our imagination and on screen. So
Yes.
it's nice to see the references that you have in the book to those.
Yes, I should say it was such a world. These were like department stores, not like we understand department stores today. They were entire universes where thousands of people worked, where they had dentist offices, where, some of them had petting zoos zoos. I mean, they were just the craziest places, right? You could spend an entire day there. So it was this whole world. And there were so many amazing photos, which you may know this from like film work, but they're very expensive to get the rights to the photos. So there were so many more that I wanted to use. There were some amazing ones that I couldn't get the rights to, or cost me an arm and a leg, so we couldn't use. But yes, I have about like 75, 80 photos, something like that in the book. So,
yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah.
This is
That's why
weird.
it's $32.
This is a weird ask, but do you mind if I just read a brief little bit? Because you were just talking about the stores.
Yeah.
So this is just from the prologue of the book, which completely enraptured me. So this is Julie Satow speaking. These are her words. So in the early 20th century, department stores were a land of glamour and possibility. In a single afternoon, you could have the details of a wedding or funeral planned, find out the dates for civil service examinations, send a telegram at a Western Union outpost, drop your baby at the nursery, and have a leisurely lunch at the tea room, followed by an appointment at the hair salon. Arrange for the express delivery of an ermine fur wrap to your home, buy refrigerated steaks, or order a pair of rare green parakeets from the Seychelles Islands. There were stores with miniature zoos, as you mentioned, and fish ponds and mechanical boats, those with emergency hospitals and trained nurses, and even one store in Oklahoma City that sponsored a baby week offering 9 infants for adoption, with 6 lucky tykes finding permanent homes. There were window displays featuring the works of George O'Keeffe and Salvador Dali, as well as those with elaborate Christmas trains and towers of delicate Easter eggs. I mean, the opulence.
Yes.
I mean, it's really amazing.
Yes.
And like I said before, I think there are places that have this now, and especially if anyone ever happens to be in London anytime near Christmas, like those window displays are out of this world.
Yeah.
But what do you and you live in New
Paris,
York
and Paris,
and Paris,
too. Yeah.
of course. But now you live in New York with your family, and so tell me, what do you see as, especially in this moment, what is the future of department stores? You know, we live in a world where there's a lot of these stores are having people can only come in by appointment only. There are thefts that are happening. So what is the future? You talk a little bit about this in the book.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I should say one of the things that was revolutionary about these department stores was that you could come in, anyone could come in, and you did not have to buy anything. You could just come in and try things on and, look at the goods and smell the perfumes. You know, that was a revolutionary thing in the, ladies' mile era of department stores. And now we've kind of, gone backwards. You're right. There's a lot of crime and theft, et cetera. I mean, I end the book purposely in the 80s because I feel like that was sort of the beginning of the end of the department store era. But in terms of today, I mean, I have very mixed feelings. I think that we've lost a cultural touchstone. You know, these were places where, whole communities would shop, whether you were wealthy, whether you were less wealthy. You could buy $10 packs of underwear or you could buy fur coats. You know, it didn't matter. Now the stores tend to be very, very high end or discount stores. There's not like that middle ground as much. You know, obviously most people buy online, which is a very different experience. You don't have that like cultural, interaction, that social interaction. But on the other hand, it's very democratic. I mean, you're interested in starting a T-shirt company? Well, you can just open an Instagram account and start selling it, you know? That wasn't possible before. There were a lot of barriers to entry. So I don't know. It's kind of a mixed bag. I feel conflicted about it. I mean, obviously, I feel the nostalgia for what was, and I wish that we still had that. Interestingly, in New York, now you have a better French accent than me, but Printemps, I don't know how to pronounce it.
Printemps?
Yeah, is opening a big department store in Lower Manhattan. So that's a big French department store. So and I think that opens next year at some point. So there is and certainly I was in Paris, maybe a year or two ago, and the department stores there still have that kind of feel. You mentioned London, I think less so. I mean, Harrods, sadly, is kind of a bit of a shell of what it used to be. There's like a lot of great, Harrods branded teddy bears, but there's not a lot of stuff there, So I don't know. It's kind of a mixed bag. I'm agnostic.
Okay. Well, the good news is, for the time that they were there, I mean, these women did really incredible things and major advancements in the marketing and finding new ways to entertain customers, all the way down to mail order businesses and all these different things. And I should also say that you're very good in the book about talking about how much money everyone made, how much money the stores made, and equating those to today's dollars. So we can see a very very realistic picture of that. But I think that all these women who really didn't have necessarily that experience really went above and beyond what their male counterparts were doing at the time, and they really brought these stores to new levels. And it's a really remarkable thing, and it's wonderful to see the portrait that you've painted in the book.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I mean, I do feel like as I say, or I should say my marketing team said, the men's names are on the buildings. We all know Bloomingdale's or Macy's,
right.
which were actual people. But inside, the women ruled. And I think that's a story that has not really been told in a way that could be told, I think that from the consumer perspective, from the shopper perspective, they had the power of the wallet. They were in charge. They were buying things. Maybe there was a male manager, but they were the ones who had power. And then from an employee perspective, I have, like you mentioned, I have a little side, I call them vignettes throughout the book. And one of them is like a woman who in 1906 in San Francisco started out, dusting china as like the earliest job, the most junior job at a department store. And by her 20s, this is in the 1910s, was, traveling to Paris to the Parisian fashion shows and had earned enough money to buy her family a home. And you know what I mean? Like it was a whole different thing. They had these massive, fulsome careers at a time when that was so rare. So, yeah, I feel like, I think that they're important stories that hopefully people will enjoy.
Yeah, no, it's a remarkable book, and congratulations on the New York Times bestseller list this past weekend.
Thank you.
But before I let you go, tell me, because I want everyone to who comes on the show, tell me, what is your favorite, and it can be in New York or elsewhere, what is your favorite independent bookstore?
Oh, I like it. Well, let's see. My local bookstore is 3 Lives, which is in the West Village, which on West 10th Street. Shout out to them. They're not on social media or anything, so I can never. But I also, McNally Jackson is obviously a big one in New York City. Yes, and they've been amazing to me. And even though Barnes & Nobles is not a local bookstore, it's interesting the way that they run them now. They're very independent, each one's. And I have to say, the Barnes & Nobles on Fifth Avenue has been amazingly warm and receptive to my book. So thank you very much. I appreciate that.
And a very important place when you're a New Yorker, because you always need to know where the Barnes & Noble is in case you need to use the loo.
Exactly. Well, now you have Starbucks, but yes.
Right, I guess so.
Yes,
now we have Starbucks.
True.
Amazing. Well, Julie, thank you so much for joining us for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And best of luck with the rest of the book tour.
Thank you. I appreciate it. This is so fun.
Talk soon.
Bye.